Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath, senior editor at Forbes. The 10th annual Forbes list of the next billion-dollar startups is out now, and on the list is a company called Promise. It is a $520 million powerhouse that is helping people who are delinquent on their utility bills pay their municipalities. I am here with the founder and CEO of Promise, Phaedra Ellis-Lamkins. Phaedra, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I just gave a brief overview of what Promise is, but I'd love to hear it in your own words. What is Promise and what does it do?
Yeah, first, thank you so much again for having me. Promise is a company that works with governments and highly regulated utilities. And what we do is we help bring money into the government through interest-free payment plans, and we help money go out to people who need resources and run aid programs like emergency water assistance or climate credits right now in the state of Washington. So anywhere the flow of money goes in and out of government is where we are.
What gave you the idea for this company?
Yeah, I think I had more of a feeling. I had a pretty diverse professional background, and I was struck with the idea that most of the technology that was being built by people who wanted technology to work for the things they cared about. Guys who wanted a taxi when they got out of a club, people who needed parking or dog walking or a dry cleaning. And it struck me that some of the world's biggest problems, or the problems that people that I grew up with, were not being addressed by technology. So originally what we wanted to do is to build a company that was focused on people who were most in need of technology and would build technology that helped people. And so it was more about kind of what was the economic model? How do you make money? How do you use capitalism? How do you use technology in a way that is not predatory, but that grows, right? We didn't want to build a social service agency. We wanted to build a beautifully working well technology company that was fundamentally dominating the market.
Now, I do want to underscore what you just said here. It is a for-profit company. It has a social mission to help people and to help governments. But at the end of the day, Promise is a for-profit company, correct?
Yeah, and we're like, the thing I want to do is I want to beat people on margins. I want to beat people on revenue, because I think people see it as a social mission because we're serving poor people, right? But if I was staying at company as like, we're going to provide services for the richest among us, people would be like, totally makes sense. But I think when you serve people who are poor in a way that isn't predatory, it becomes a social mission. But that's what I want to do. It's like, I want to be clear that we should build companies that at the core of their mission is winning for their customers, which in our case is government and poor people.
Let's go through a typical use case, if you will. So my colleague, Amy Feldman, the editor of the Next Billion Dollar Startup List, has a great profile, and you should go on Forbes.com to read all about Promise in detail. But for folks watching this video, let's say I'm a consumer in Pennsylvania. I have fallen behind on my utility payments. The municipality, my local government, is coming after me for those payments. Where does Promise enter that equation?
Yeah, it's a great question. So in the use case of, we basically have two products. Payment plans are one of our products. And in payment plans, we find you. And so we get an bill. Think about it as we get a file of all the people who are behind. We reach out to you by text and we say, hey, we see you're behind. Are you interested in getting an interest-free payment plan? And people can sign up. Think of it as a subscription payment plan, and they can pay through any method, and there's flexibility. And so we find you, you would sign up in app. Sometimes people find out about us through call center agents, or you might call and say, I'm behind, or you get a call and someone's referred to us. But most people sign up through a text message they receive saying you're behind.
Interest-free sounds almost too good to be true. We're in this era of buy now, pay later and high interest rates. So if I get a text message saying interest-free, I'm a journalist, I'm inherently skeptical, but I think given the economic environment we're in, I would wonder, is this for real? So I guess what I'm asking is, how do you do that? And how do you as a for-profit company then make money if consumers are engaging with you on an interest-free basis?
Yeah, it's a great question. So maybe I'll answer it with the economics and then the reason why those economics work. And so the economics are, for example, one of the cities profiled in the article that Amy wrote is the city of Richmond, Virginia. That's our client. They signed people up on payment plans all the time. And before we got there, they had less than a 15% success rate. And so if you think about the fact that they're trying to collect money themselves, that they're spending the same amount of energy and time that in fact they probably someone called to set it up, they probably had to apply to be able to put on a payment plan. So one thing that they have to do is they have to have the infrastructure to offer a payment plan. The second thing is most people fail, and then they end up at collections where they either sell the debt, and this is different than Richmond, but in most cities they sell the debt. So you end up with a debt collector, you might get 20 cents on the dollar. You shut the person off. So in a utilities case, you have to have staffing to shut someone off. You sell the debt for less than it's worth. And people are unsuccessful, and you cannot plan for the finances of the utility. And so in that case, the debt that was behind was 13% of their overall revenues. It's a pretty significant economic hit. We come in and we say, we're going to sign people up for a payment plan. We have a really good sense for predictability of how many people we will get into a payment plan. And we see anywhere between an 85 to 95% repayment rate. So you go to someone and say, you are not getting any money back right now. You're having to shut people off. You're staffing this yourself. We're going to come in and you no longer have to staff it. We're going to increase your repayment rate to 85%. In the case of Richmond, Virginia, it's 93%. And so it makes sense for the utility in that case to be able to make the investment of paying us, because they lose the operational cost and they keep a continuous source of income, and they never have to shut off. And so that's how it works. So the jurisdiction pays us because our principle is, and we got offered a contract as an example in a state who we love and have a relationship with around property taxes. And they said, we want you to perk on property taxes. State law requires we charge interest. And we just said, we cannot charge interest and will not. So you have to figure out a way to not charge interest, because we're just not going to do it.
It's so interesting, but when you apply the term government tech to your space, I think some investors' eyes can glaze over. It's not the sexiest space. What was the reaction when you took Promise to Silicon Valley, to the venture capital world, to seek funding? Because you do have $51 million in funding, so you've been successful in finding investors. But what was that process like?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so we've been lucky that we haven't really touched our last raise because we're profitable as a company. And so we raised in 21. And so we've been good financial stewards of the company, which I think matters. But when we were initially raising, I think a couple things happened. One, I'd run revenue at a company that I'm now on the board of. So I think people had a good sense like, oh, you get how to make money. And I think our investors, some had experience with government, but most did not. And I think they believed that we understood the market, that we knew how to make money, and that the market is pretty significant. If you look at government spending around these issues, it's much larger than the private sector in many cases. And I think large companies sell to those markets, right? You can't imagine a Microsoft without selling to the government. But it's a new thing, I think, for investors. But I think they got that you're going to make money. You understand what the total addressable market is. You know how to sell. And we were able to sell pretty quickly, which I think gave people a sense of confidence. But and we were purposeful about the investors we took. We wanted investors who deeply understood how to scale and grow, and also knew how to run operations well.
You talk about growing pretty quickly. I think Amy had a line in there about how you didn't have a sales department. It's inbound interest. So is word of mouth just spreading faster than you can get the word out yourself?
So embarrassing. Our sales team is growing. We just hired 2 new people. It's been 2 of us. And I think that I wanted to make sure the product was really strong. So I think when you have a strong product, it does sell itself. And I think one of the clients we introduced, Amy, who did the Forbes piece, wrote like a 3-page list of why Promise worked. And I was like, she should be our person, our marketing spend, because she was like, promise made, promise kept. Here's the economics. Here's why it makes sense. And so I think building credibility worked for us, building a product that worked well and not focusing on selling, but really focusing on delivering was the right way for us to do it.
You said embarrassing, but it just sounds like you were dealing with a lean operation and you wanted proof of concept before building out a sales department and really going whole hog.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, I think our investors are very interesting because for a long time they're like, spend more. And then I think the last downturn of the economy people were like, "Oh, that was so smart." That was like brilliant, because I was like, "I'm not." That was brilliant, because I think there was a time in venture where people were just like growth, 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 spend, spend, spend. I just don't think that's sustainable. I think I'm not a young founder. I understand how important these things are to people that we serve, and a lot of times if we send a text that sends the wrong message, that your water's going to get shut off, that you're not going to get aid, or you're going to get aid and you really don't, the consequences of our work are really significant. So I wanted to make sure we could really deliver. And I just thought putting our head up and hiring a big team was not the right decision for us. And it ended up working out for us. But for a while, I had a lot of pressure to spend more. And so I love this moment, this like, the company's got to work moment. It's a moment that we were built for in many ways.
It's so interesting because in Forbes Women and at Forbes in general, we talk about how female founders and female founders of color are often more capital efficient than their white male counterparts. And what you have just described seems like an example in action of that capital efficiency and how that can pay off later on, even when you're getting pressure to spend, spend, spend.
Especially, I think, because we could raise. I think what I was lucky about, I think, as a female founder and a founder of color, is that, which very few Black women have this experience, that I could raise capital, right? Like if we wanted to raise right now, we could raise a very high valuation, we could raise a lot of capital. But it is unusual, I think, that we were just like, I don't want to dilute the company. I want people who work here to become independently wealthy. And I want our product to be amazing. And so if I spend my time fundraising, if I'm thinking about returns in a different way, like, am I in the articles? Am I doing this? Instead of saying like, does our product deliver? Do the economics of the company make sense? Like, we don't do business if the margins don't make sense. And I think that's the right thing for us. But yeah, I definitely think you're right that I see it among female founders. I also think I see it among people who have life experience in different ways, because it's like, at some point it is not sustainable to not make money. And the growth required for that thesis to work is so high. Like, it makes sense if you're Amazon, but it doesn't make sense for startups with 50 people to have fancy offices. Like, I always know, we have a joke internally, when someone's going to fail when you walk in and it's a startup and they have an office that's been designed by someone. And you're just like, oh, that was not the right decision. That was not the right decision.
You mentioned a different background. Phaedra, can you talk a little bit about your own personal background and how that has fueled both the idea for the company and the way you are growing it?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up with, in some ways, really lucky, which is my mom was not wealthy. My family was not wealthy, but I was lucky that I was smart. So I was in a lot of programs where I got to see the way that people who had a lot of resources lived. And there's some negative consequences, because then you realize I'm not one of those people and I get treated really differently. But it also gave me a strong sense of justice, a strong sense of what I wanted for my own life and what I wanted for other people. Because one of the most clarifying moments for me is in my life was going from free lunch to reduced lunch, which is you just paid 40 cents instead of having it free. And the lack of dignity we give kids. And so, like, when I was getting lunch, the people who had free lunch, they would call it out and you would stand in the free lunch line. So, because you needed a different system, because they had to check you off instead of taking money. And I just like felt embarrassed. I was the only one in my classes ever that was on free lunch. And it gave me a sense of shame. And I just think we are better than that as a country. And we should use technology to make it so that kids don't feel shame because they're in poverty. And so that's what drives me, is like, how do I build the government that I think kids deserve?
How do I build the government that kids deserve? Continuing along that line, you did not start your career in fintech. You worked in labor organizing. Can you talk about the jobs that you had before Promise? Because they're all very, very interesting.
Sure. Yeah, I have a very weird career. And I started in the labor movement, working for unions, and really focused on organizing, because I thought the most important thing you could do is build economic power for people, that you can increase wages and give people independence to be able to make the best decisions for themselves. And so I spent a lot of time in the labor movement. I ended up running a labor federation and thinking about, how do you create policy? I then went. I was fascinated with the idea that there was a lot of false choices in the labor movement, and one of those false choices was jobs versus the environment. And it struck me that always jobs like paving or anything else. We'd be like, we need those, right? Because they're good jobs. But it was always like poor communities that ended up with the consequences of that, whether waste incinerators or roads or anything else. And so I wanted to understand, how could we build an environmental agenda that worked for working people and that was not kind of like fancy people. Like, it felt like it was like all the fancy people who didn't realize they needed jobs. Like, you still need to go to work. And so I went to work at an organization called Green for All. I ran that organization, and then I was ended up weirdly working with the musician Prince, and working with him, and it was really interesting because I saw a common thing happening, which is technology was not good in any of those places. In the labor movement, it changed the way people worked, so it devalued physical work. In the environment, the consequences of it were pretty significant, from the physical components to the way we thought about growth. And then in music, it was devaluing content. So you had musicians of color, musicians who were all of a sudden the things they did were valued less than they were before. And so I wanted to understand, how could you have a vision for technology that helped people, that was good for people. And so I went to a company called Honor, which was focused on home healthcare and using technology to build home healthcare. Was there. I went there to run operations. I ended up running revenue, everything that wasn't engineering, and then I learned a lot. It was like the best school. It was the best school to learn, and especially running revenue, because you just learn about the choices. And then left. I joined the board of that company and started Promise.
And then the idea before Promise was actually grounded in bail reform. Can you talk a little bit
Absolutely.
about that?
Yeah. What I was struck by is that like 2/3 of the people who are incarcerated in county jails are there because they can't afford to get out. So ideally, you think bail is a way to keep people like who people think are potentially a risk to society incarcerated. But most people who are actually incarcerated are not people because of high risk situations. They're just there because they're poor. And so I wanted to understand how technology could help. And I had a personal thing, which is someone I cared about, had to make a choice because they had child support and DUI payments, and they couldn't do both. So then there was a warrant out for their arrest, and they misread the court date. So they'd gone, and it looked, and I could see it. It looked like a 4, and it was a 9, or I don't remember. No, it must have been. It was. They thought it was a 9, and it looked like a 4, and they didn't know how to deal with it. And I was lucky that my co-founder is a criminal defense lawyer, and so we were like, "This is horrible." I was like, "This is horrible. Can you believe this?" And she was like, "Yeah, it happens all the time." And so we dealt with it and helped him. But I just realized that like there's just practical cases of people who are good humans who have these kind of false choices. Do I pay this? Do I make sure I do child support? And I wanted to build something that gave people the ability to not think of incarceration. You should keep working. There should be an incentive for you to keep working. And being incarcerated for someone who has a full-time job, who is a full-time dad, who wants to be a good parent, like, we should want that to work for people. And that seemed to me what technology should be good at.
And then ultimately, there was a line in Amy's story where you were building that product and you saw the way that it could be used for opposite intents, and you got
Yes.
the advice to pivot. How hard was that pivot moment for you?
I mean, it was really scary because I was in a meeting and I was just like sitting there. I just was like, oh, and it wasn't that they would use the technology for bad. It was that the efficiency would ultimately be harmful, because even if you do something good, if you build for a system that's fundamentally not working well for people, then you realize you've made a system more efficient, right? At the essence of the institution. And so I had to call investors, and I was scared because I think at that point we'd raised maybe $7 million. Very few Black females had been able to raise that kind of capital. And I was worried, like, does it make me look insane that I'm like, oh, I don't want to do this business because I think it's a bad business. It doesn't feel good. And we have clients. And so I was very personally cognizant of the idea, like, that I was carrying other people with me, and that I didn't want to let people down. And also the people that believed in us, like the people who trusted us as customers. And so we made the pivot. I was very lucky, and I think this is why investors matter. I did not have one investor who was not supportive and just said, like, one of them, Bill, said to me, go in the forest, find yourself. And I just think most women and people of color don't get that. We're just like, go find yourself, you'll figure it out. But without fail, that is what our investors said.
That is such interesting advice. And now with Promise, I just want to go back to those repayment rates because it's pretty astounding changes that you're seeing in some of these municipalities. Something like 13% repayment or 30% repayment going up to 85, 95. What happens to the 5% who, even with no interest, are not able to pay their bills?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what the institution is that we're working with, right? In some places, let's say you're a water or electric utility, your power or water gets shut off. So, which is pretty severe in this time, in with heat and um, uh, water. Like it's the basics. Like all of the things we work on are the basics, and so those are the consequences. So we don't obviously shut some off. We send them back and we say they haven't been able to fulfill their payment plan with us. But if you don't pay it, there's pretty severe consequences on everything we do.
And how would you characterize Promise's growth? I mean, we talked a little bit earlier about how word of mouth is spreading and you're choosing now to build out the sales team. But what's your
Yeah.
projection for the next year or two in terms of revenue growth and markets
Yeah.
that you're in?
Yeah. I mean, this year we're in the tens of millions, and next year we'll be over 100. And part of that is because our largest revenue actually doesn't come from payment plans. Our largest revenue comes from running aid programs for government, for states, and there we're getting money out. So what we do is we use machine learning and we say for states, and I'll give maybe two examples. State of Virginia, we ran their water assistance program. So we go find out who's on SNAP, who's on different programs. We go get their utility information, and we're able to send you a text message and say, you qualify for this program. Please click this link. Which is why I joked about the text message, because when you get that message, like you should be getting money from the government, click here. It does feel a little, it feels great, but it feels a little shocking. And in that, and we've given out a couple $100 million. And in some places, it looks like the state of Washington. We're working on climate credits, $200. 1 in 4 families will get those climate credits on their utility bill. And so that's actually where you see a lot of our revenue growth is not through payment plans continue to grow, but our work on aid in state governments is actually the largest part of our revenue as a company right now.
That's so interesting. And it leads into a quote actually from Van Jones, who you worked with, or how did you work with Van Jones? He's known on CNN, but there was a Prince connection there.
No, so I've known him forever. He used to be the executive director of a nonprofit in Oakland. And it's funny because we met many years ago. And at the time he was like, you're so harsh. All you care, like he was harsh, and he was like very progressive and young. And I like was in the labor room in politics. And I was like, you have to measure results. Like it has to be much more pragmatic at the time. But I known him for a long, long time.
Okay, so Amy spoke with him for her story, and he said about the work that you did with Prince, because you helped Prince get rights to his master recordings. And he had said, Phaedra forced the powers that be to relent. And I'm wondering, is that a mission statement for what you're doing with Promise? Are you trying to change an industry here?
Yeah, it's a one. Thank you to Van. It is. I actually think people want to do well, right? Like we have pretty diverse clients, everyone from Republican to Democratic governors to utilities, like in our local work. And my belief is most people want government to be more efficient. I happen to come to it from a justice perspective, but it is really most people want government to work better. But I do think that government is not evolving quickly enough. It's not. And I think there's some places like digital driver's licenses as an example, where because of a digital wallet, people are going to have to figure stuff out. But I definitely see my job as to make institutions accountable to the people that rely on them, and to do it in a way that is beautiful and that gives people both grace and dignity. But yeah, absolutely. Because the one thing that drives me insane is in the defense industry, no one thinks that government should like go build planes themselves. No one thinks that government should run certain parts. We should have the same expectation on health and human services. It should run the most effective, and we should expect that it does. And that's what we are building as a company, is the expectation that the things that technology should do, it should do well, and we should build it, and we should make that investment.
Are you seeing copycat competitors come in and do what you do? And or if not, would you welcome competitors to the space?
Yeah, it's so funny. One of these companies just launched a product called Promise to Pay, which was hysterical. But we definitely see competitors. And an investor actually emailed me this morning and said, someone just like people like literally just cut and paste your material. And I think the thing that is good about that, the big competitors, the large SaaS companies and enterprise companies, I don't worry so much about them because the product's still really poor and it takes so much for them to shift, right? They can't shift as easily. The smaller startups or the companies that exist in the space that just copy our language and then trash you, which is always shocking because one of the clients were about to go before an agency to have the vote on the contract. The current provider was like, they're horrible. We've never met them ever, right? They're horrible. And they can't give any examples, right? So they're just like, oh, people don't like them. And it was, and we are launching a product called Promise to Pay. So we were like, okay, got it. But I think that's what people do. And the thing I try to remind myself, competitors will make our product better. It will make us have to be quicker. It will make us have to deliver better. It's putting pressure on me to like feel like we got to build a stronger sales team so that we can be selling. Like we can't just build the most beautiful, perfect product. And so I like it because before I've mostly in my mind been competitive with defense contractors where I'm just like, okay, how are they growing this quickly? Okay, I gotta be quicker than this company grew. I gotta be, faster. So the good part about competitors is it like excites me, which I'm not sure is healthy, but I'm just like, yeah, like it just drives something in me where I'm like, great, now we got to beat those people.
I don't know. I think competition can fuel growth. And on that note, we're sitting here in August 2024, a few months out from the presidential election. A lot can happen that will affect the governments that you work with. If we were to speak 1 year from today, what do you expect to be able to tell me that Promise has accomplished?
Yeah, I expect to be able to say we are running government programs in pretty diverse states. Those programs have changed the application flow because it doesn't make sense that governments ask the same information from people over and over and over again, and that they don't have a way to manage fraud. Like at this point, the idea that there's like investigators when you could actually use AI or other tools to evaluate documents instead of like, having kind of investigators going out to people's door. And so my expectation is that we will increase the amount of people we're able to build beautiful but accountable programs that are efficient for government. And that I'll be able to say to you that we are doing it, that they are growing, the company is rapidly growing, and that we're really proud of the work that we're doing around payment plans. We signed contracts for large national utility companies that we launched this year. And so I think I want to talk to you about the amount of the market we're impacting, which is I want to be able to say we're in 30% of the market, and that's a really important marker for us.
Phaedra Ellis-Lamkins, thank you so much for joining us and telling us about Promise. And I do hope to check in with you in a year to see how much Promise has grown. But in the meantime, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.